Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Ida Rademacher. I am the Executive Director of the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute, and I also co-chair the Aspen Partnership for an Inclusive Economy. And I'm so delighted to be here this morning with all of you and with my friend and colleague, Professor Dorothy Brown. This is the most anticipated hour of my year, mainly as I bring Dorothy on. We've been talking about this for over a year. Welcome, Dorothy. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Just to make sure that all of the hundreds of folks who have signed up for this know they're in the right place, I have in front of me, I'm holding up a picture of your new book released yesterday. Let me see if I can get it in the camera. The Whiteness of Wealth: How the Tax System Impoverishes Americans and How We Can Fix It. And congratulations on
Thank you.
Published. We have been talking about this for a long time, and just to give a little context as we get started, and I'm not going to do a lot of preamble about what Aspen does in this work or anything else, because I think we'll get into it as the conversation goes on. But at least at the Financial Security Program, we've been working for a number of years now on a lot of the different kinds of financial challenges that face American households. And in not a single one of those over the last 6 years, do we not come to a place where there's racial disparities in those challenges. And, so as we try to navigate those, I have often said to my team, let me call up my colleague, Dorothy Brown. And for those of you who are joining us, Dorothy, Professor Brown she's the Asa Griggs Candler Professor at Emory University School of Law, and the most nationally renowned tax policy, race, class expert I know. And we've spent a lot of time on the phone the last year trying to make sense of the changing tide of opportunity to really start to do something different about the kind of disparities in our world. So just welcome to you, and thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted. We were plotting this last year when we were in person, and here we are. So thank you so much.
Well, we really talked at that point. You were at the Aspen Leadership Forum on retirement savings, and we were starting to put racial equity front and center in the retirement system conversation there. And that's when you said, that's one part of a giant layered cake that I am writing about tax policy, which I think really reflects a whole lifetime of work. But I want to start with a quote that's actually at the end of your book, and we have the luxury of time today to unpack a conversation and at least give all of the folks listening a sense of the breadth of insights that are offered in the book. But we're not going to hover too long over any one of them, because I want to spend a lot of time on the solutions section as well. I think that there's a lot of folks tuning in that will want to hear about that. But we'll go back to the beginning of the book. But toward the end, you say, at first glance, tax policy may not seem an obvious way to fight systemic racism, but its effects on Black families are insidious, debilitating, and ubiquitous. My sense is that that's a realization that came to you slowly and somewhat painfully. So I wonder if we start at the end, maybe you go back to the beginning and say a little bit about who you are and how this book came to be.
So I fell into this research. In fact, I went into tax law because I just knew it had nothing to do with race. In fact, I knew the only color that mattered was green. And imagine my surprise when I became an academic to discover or to think about maybe race has something to do with tax. And how I got there was by filling out my parents' tax returns. And every year I'd fill out my return, I'd fill out their return. My income by myself was equal to my parents' combined income. And something always was off in their tax return. I thought they were paying too much, but I was doing it right, but I couldn't figure out what the problem was. So fast forward, I have the luxury of time when I become an academic, and I read an article that says, how do you know there isn't a race and tax question if you don't look? And I thought, oh my gosh, could race have something to do with tax? And it was written, the article was written by a mentor. And I picked up the phone and I said, I'm going to write about race and tax. Easier said than done. Because if you take away nothing else from my talk today, take away this. The IRS does not collect or publish statistics by race. So everything in my book would have remained hidden had I not become a detective of sorts to find information elsewhere. Okay, so I make this promise and then I discover, where am I going to get this data from? So I basically turned myself into a detective. Whatever I've read, I was looking for some clues. And I read a Commission on Civil Rights report that said 40% of household income is contributed by Black wives compared to 29% by white wives. Now to you, that means nothing. To me, I had just struck gold because it explained why my parents are paying so much in taxes. They were paying so much in taxes because their incomes were close together. My mother and my father made almost identical amounts of income. Some years, my father's overtime would put him over the top. Some years, my mother would. Because their incomes were close together, when they got married, they wound up ultimately paying higher taxes simply because they were married. So this quest for does race have something to do with tax started with the marriage penalty and ended with my 25 years of research that led me to the conclusion that regardless of what Black and white Americans do, tax policy subsidizes white Americans and disadvantages Black Americans.
And we'll unpack layer by layer where that conversation goes, where the data is, and also you had to layer into data a lot of lived experience. You do a lot of translating in each piece of this book for people like me, for others in the world that really that it's not intuitive the ways that tax policy is the case. I came into tax policy in a different way, just to take it back up for folks on the line and viewing. Overall, as we have a conversation about racial inequity in the US and specifically the drivers and the dimensions of the racial wealth gap, I think that the disparities on display during COVID they've been around health, they've been around income, and then we're increasingly seeing this wealth divide that grows and grows as the stock market goes forward and as we're having this K-shaped recovery in terms of who's working and who's not. It's not intuitive that tax policy is at the center of either a problem or the solution, but as you can talk about, as you unpack what is tax policy and what is tax law, is how does it play that central role? For folks who understand those pieces of a balance sheet, we already know that if you have wealth in America, it usually shows up in 3 places, maybe 4, right? It shows up as home equity. It shows up as saving or stock investments, primarily through retirement savings for most Americans. It shows up to the degree that there is small business. It can show up in small business wealth. And then of course it shows up because of how people are educated and what kind of degree they have and what kind of job they get. You say that each one of those has a basis in the stock market or in tax policy. And when we talked about this in preparation, and I said, if you had to pick just one, you told me that was a little bit like having to pick one of your kids. So can you talk a little bit about just broadly the headline here about tax policy in each of these dimensions that you go through in the book?
Yes, so you mentioned home equity, and I did a New York Times op-ed piece on Sunday that talked about this. And really, tax policy interacts with societal racism, or as I like to say, taxpayers bring their racial identities onto their 1040. Even though there's no box that gets checked, I'm still Black when I complete my taxes, which means the systemic racism that has worked against me gets replicated and magnified in our tax system. So let's start with home equity. So we have tax subsidies for home ownership. And you're right, a white middle class has been built off of home equity. But what we see is the housing market is racist and anti-Black. What do I mean by that? Homes in predominantly Black or racially diverse neighborhoods are worth less than similar homes in white neighborhoods. Okay, why is that? Because most white homeowners do not want to live in a neighborhood with too many Black neighbors. Now, whenever I say that, I get pushback, right? The pushback is, I'm not a racist, but I'm worried about my home values. Or there's just a small percentage that are racist, and that causes all of the problems. That centers a white perspective. White Americans are interested in intent, but Black Americans who are harmed don't care whether you are a racist or you are acting like one. Because you do not want to live next door to people, too many people who look like me, I'm harmed, right? So we have tax subsidies for home ownership. The majority of homeowners are white. So tax subsidies for home ownership are going to benefit white homeowners. At which point you say, well, Dorothy, isn't the solution to just increase the number of Black homeowners? Yes and no. First, Black homeowners have significantly higher equity than renters. So it is a good thing to be a homeowner. However, when I buy a home, if I buy where I want to buy, where most Black Americans want to buy, I'm going to not have a good financial investment. And if I buy a home in an all-white neighborhood, I'm going to have a good financial investment, but I'm going to have problems. My neighbors might call the cops on me. My students might be racially profiled. So tax subsidies for home ownership not only benefits the majority of home ownership, it benefits how white Americans experience home ownership with tax-free gains on sale.
Right.
And that's just one of my children.
I know. Well, I loved how you said it. You said, well, you're choosing among your kids would be hard. The marriage penalties and the marriage subsidies, they're kind of like your first kid, right? This is the one you discovered because you were right out of the block. Homeownership was probably second because you were actually, you were in the world of finance. And you
Homeownership was my last child.
Really?
In terms of articles, okay, and I'll explain how that happened, right? So I write this marriage penalty, marriage bonus, and I got pushback from tax academics. In fact, this is one of my favorite not so funny stories where I'm at a law professor conference and a tax academic, and I presented my marriage penalty bonus work. And the first comment was to me, Dorothy, everybody knows your work is irrelevant because Blacks are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes. Okay, so people are like, what? So I obviously respond that if you're right, then we all want our kids to grow up to be poor. No, we don't. We want our kids to grow up to be like Warren Buffett, right? With lots of income subject to either no tax or the low preferential rate. Okay. So I got pushback, and one of the pieces of the pushback was, well, Dorothy, this is really interesting, but I don't think you should write about this until you have a solution. Well, my response was, I needed tenure, and that might have taken me over 10 years to write, and I wouldn't have gotten it. But more importantly, how do you eat an elephant? One spoonful at a time. So I had to take little pieces and then think about, because remember, I'm studying the Internal Revenue Code from a race and class perspective. Nobody has done this. I'm doing it. I want to make sure I'm getting it right. So I talk about home ownership, and then I go, I think, to the earned income tax credit, and then I go to retirements, and then I go to home ownership. And I did it from the rate structure was marriage, as well as the earned income tax credit. Exclusions were retirement accounts. Home ownership was the deduction provision I looked at. So I was marching through different types of provisions, credits, rate structure, and along the way talked about the preferential rate for capital gains. But the last piece of scholarship I did was home ownership. And I really, with homeownership, figured out how race is brought into the tax law. It was what was going on in the market. It was the market for homeownership that was intersecting with the tax policy that caused white homeowners to win and Black homeowners to lose.
Mm-hmm. And we'll
And
get
it's only after 25 years of studying that I began to say, oh, I think I know how we could fix this. But before, I was just figuring out where the problem was.
Yeah, and you do. I want to, point this out for folks who are joining us today. Each of your chapters has a lot of clear analysis of the issue and suggestions for solutions. At the end of the day, you kind of zoom back out though and say, but here's the deal, right? You say, but here's the big three. But there's actually a lot of playbook all the way through here, both for the systems and for individuals.
Right, right.
And you actually clarify, and I'm just wondering how this came out for you. You even kind of dig into the individuals, and you have advice for Black Americans, and you have advice for white Americans. And it's not the same.
No, one of these is not like the other. Yes, yeah. It is not the same. And mainly, and like you say, each chapter I have solutions for that particular problem. But when I think about homeownership, right, the advice I give to Black Americans is to be intentional. When you buy a home, recognize that depending on where you buy will determine whether it will be a good financial investment for you. And if you buy in a racially diverse or majority Black neighborhood, do not become house poor. Do not put all your money into your house. Save some of your money from investing in the housing market for the stock market, or a 529 college savings account, or beefing up your retirement account, because you have to diversify. Because for you, your home is not going to pay off the way your white working colleagues' home will pay off, right? So that's the advice I give for Black Americans. And I actually started writing my homeownership piece when I was selling a home in Virginia, and I lived on a racially diverse neighborhood. The first home I bought and sold, it was an all-white neighborhood, subdivision, like 200 houses. It was me and one other Black family that I didn't even meet till I was about to move out. Mm-hmm. That house sold like that. I made money. So I thought that's how it worked. Then I'm doing this research and I'm putting my house on the market and I have no takers. And I'm like, what is going on? And then I realized, it's people who look like me and my neighbors who look like me who are causing fewer buyers to want to look in that neighborhood. Okay, so I figured that out the hard way. But the advice for white Americans is your preferences, whether they are virulent racism or I'm worried about protecting my investment, your decision to live with not many Black neighbors is causing harm to me and other Black homeowners. So,
and that's one dimension of it. And I want to go on to some of the other kids here. But I think the other thing you point out, and we certainly did a lot of work at when we did a 2-year deep dive on home affordability and home and housing stability, is that there's a big disparity between home ownership in general, between African American and white American households, for lots of reasons that go into these other issues, but also just centering tax incentives and credits or deductions around ownership, but having nothing that's parallel in a rental place creates even more of a way that the tax system itself isn't created to be realistic with the lives of many Black Americans. So that's another part that you really do get into.
Absolutely. So any subsidy for home ownership is going to benefit those, the majority of whom own homes. The majority of Black and Latinx are renters. So they're left out. That's why, part of this rhetoric around, well, we just need to increase the percentage of Black and Latinx homeowners misses the operation of the market. But yes, right off the bat, when we have tax subsidies for homeownership, we're helping white people and we're not helping Black people, because most white Americans are not renters, but most Black Americans are.
And goes back and back. And when you actually, let's go ahead and back into, I think two of the other really important pieces to tease into would be when you even think about the process of getting a home, there's a down payment, there's an access to credit issue. So you have pretty extensive work in here on both education and on what you call best jobs. And funny, you said, if education had been your first kid, you might not have had any others because it made you so mad. But I wonder if maybe we go through those in turn. Maybe we do education a little bit. And again, we're not going to be able to get into all of this for everybody. I'm loving seeing all the questions. Please keep them coming. We're going to go plow through them later, and maybe we'll get to some of them. And we'll get to that homeownership piece as well. But I think that the question about education not teeing people up, and then I think the other part of for homeownership that you also get into is legacy issues of inheritance and things like that. So let's go ahead, and before we go there, just to make sure this is here, somebody's Armando saying, you're saying white people should buy homes within a diverse community instead of a majority white community. That's not what you're saying.
Actually, what I'm saying is it's white preferences that are driving the racism in the housing market.
Right.
If white Americans viewed all equal neighborhoods the same, we wouldn't have this differential in housing prices. Okay, so of course, and I saw one of the questions is, well, doesn't that raise gentrification, right? The reason that the housing market is depressed because Black people live there is not because the house itself is not a good house, it's because of what it's perceived as, right? So gentrification is a problem, and it's a particular problem when white Americans move in to a racially diverse neighborhood and try to center their experiences. So one of the pieces of advice I give to white homeowners, if you want to live in a racially diverse neighborhood, don't make it about you, because that neighborhood was doing fine without you, right? You need to come in, you need to understand the culture, and you need to go with it and not say, well, I don't want this. So yeah, it is important. And also one of my solutions deals with a wealth credit that would give to people in gentrifying neighborhoods, Black Americans in gentrifying.
We're gonna spend a lot of time on the wealth credit. Don't you worry.
Right?
I'm excited
it
about
would
that.
give them money every April 15th that would enable them to pay additional property taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, that is an issue, but I think I address it before I'm done with the book.
Yeah, I think you do too. So let's think about
college.
Switch to education for a minute. Let's switch to college, and let's and just take us through the top line of the ways that the tax code disproportionately plays into, again, enhancing wealth disparity around education.
And it has to do with, well, Ida said that if this had been my first child, none of the others may have been born, because this college chapter, the Great Unequalizer, depressed me more than any of the other chapters. And to be clear, it's not like the other chapters were uplifting. This one was just so depressing and made me shut down the computer and just go stare at the ocean for a couple of hours to talk myself into even going back home, forget like doing more research. And this was the statistic. 60% of Black Americans don't graduate from college. 60% of those who attend don't graduate, okay? So they have debt, but they don't have a degree, and they're not able to get another job, a good job that would allow them to amortize the debt. So that statistic took me out. That is a function of where we go to college. If you go to a selective school, the graduation rates are very, very high. If you go to a really selective school, they're like 90-something%.
And there's parity, Black and white, in terms of completion.
It's close. It's
Yeah.
not equal, but it's close. it would be like 96 and 94. Okay. I mean, that's really close. Well, these selective institutions are the wealthiest among us. They don't pay, they're not for profits. They don't pay taxes. They don't pay taxes on their endowment. And they're not necessarily not necessarily, they are not admitting a lot of Black students.
Yeah.
So they're getting tax subsidized to create white spaces for white kids to do really well and graduate. Okay, so that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is we have very limited tax breaks for people who self-finance their college education. And Black students are more likely to self-finance or have their parents take out loans. Well, you only get a $2,500 deduction for interest, and there are income cutoffs, 85,000 if you're single, 170 if you're married. Imagine two Black college graduates, each with 50 something thousand dollars of debt. They will not be able to take all of their interest in the early years because it's higher than 2,500, but they could take a good portion of it. Well, God forbid they marry each other. Now they can only take $2,500. That is crazy. So that's one other way that the tax law disadvantages Black Americans who are more likely to graduate with higher debt loads than their white peers.
Well, and you also, oh, go ahead.
And then the last way has to do with how white kids pay for their college.
Right.
Grandparents and parents make gifts to pay for their college. Well, how can they do that? Because they have wealth. Whereas Black college students don't have grandma and grandpa who are here under Jim Crow to build up the wealth to enable them to pay for that college. So the tax-free treatment of gifts and inheritances validates the way white Americans finance college and disadvantage the way Black Americans do.
It struck me as you described this in the book, and you also talk about that there's other places that just where the disparities show up, where even high income parents of Black students have much higher debt loads.
Yes, they cannot protect, wealthy Black parents cannot protect their students, their children from student debt the way their wealthy white peers can. And here's why. Because they don't have as much home equity. We just talked about the racist housing market, and they don't have financial assets like stock to the extent their peers do. So they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the wealth, and they don't have the wealth in the same way their white peers do. Yeah. So we need to always focus across the income spectrum, not just on low income Blacks, not just on middle income Blacks, but on high income Blacks, because many white Americans think, oh, once you're a Black middle class, you've made it. And what my book shows is au contraire, that's not true.
Well, reading that reminded me of a statistic I had to go back and look up that I wrote in a congressional testimony, and it turns out it's 10 years ago now, but I often used to say this, and you make a point over and over again in the book that income is not the same as wealth. And I think that there's so many ways that seems like a no-brainer, but there's so much important nuance to that. And this statistic, I went back and looked it up. It was a Brookings Institution piece, again, over a decade ago. And this was, I used to make the distinction that middle income does not equal middle class. And because like many of the people in your book, I'm much more comfortable talking about class than race. And your book has really, I think, made a case for why we need to push ourselves always right now to not stay in our comfort zone and to not conflate how we solve for these things. But the statistic was this: Pew, 2009, 2 families, solidly middle income. If you looked at their children 1 generation later, everything else looked the same. 45% of the Black children whose parents were solidly middle income were at the bottom of the income distribution as adults. That percentage for kids that were white was 16%. So I used to say that there was something else that was making the middle sticky. There was something else that was in there. And I think a lot of that something else is wealth, but I also think a lot of that something else is how tax policy was playing in. And so when I think about that to this, it is what were the additional resources of that high income family to be able to finance the kids' college. And you say this a lot, and we can go into the good jobs piece too, because when you think about, it's not even that there's not wealth creation going on, but there is a much bigger extended set of needs connected to any particular Black person in the job market with one of the best jobs you talk about. So let's pivot to that a little bit and kind of like connect the dots here.
Yeah, so research shows that Black college graduates are more likely to send money home to their parents, and white college graduates are more likely to receive money from their parents. So even if you have a Black American with a six-figure job, they are financing, supporting a parent, a sibling, perhaps a grandparent that is not tax deductible. Their next door neighbor at work who's white is getting money from their parents for a down payment for a home, to make sure their student loans are paid off, to pay for K through 12 of that colleague's children or their parents' grandchildren, right? So money is flowing down, whereas in the Black household, there's this competition between grandparent and grandchild, right? Do I make sure that my mother isn't evicted, or do I set aside money for my child? So it's heartbreaking to think about people who have done everything right. I went to college, I got the degree, I got the best job, and I'm still doing worse than treading water.
Yeah.
I just want to say the reason I call it the best jobs is because it comes with tax-free benefits like health insurance and retirement accounts.
That's the
right?
thing. You make that's another place where you say that it's not always just about income
That's right.
Or as we talk about it in our most recent financial security framework, there's wage income, there's labor income, and there's non-labor income. And let's be really clear that they both matter a lot. And then in that non-labor income, there's a set of benefits that are really part of that. So, and for you, I think you were quoting some of the great Brandeis research,
Yes.
but I think it's you said a third of benefits, a third of overall salary package
Right.
is that
benefits.
So talk a little bit. So talk a little bit more about how occupational segregation and the tax code come into play in such a big way in your analysis.
So what you find is there are white occupations, there are Black occupations, there are Latinx occupations, and the white occupations are the ones most likely to come with tax-free benefits of health insurance and retirement accounts. And the predominantly Black occupations are least likely to have those tax-free perks. And what you see is even when a Black American is able to get one of those great jobs, and you've climbed Mount Everest to get to this point, when you get one of those jobs, Black Americans are more likely to have to withdraw money from their retirement accounts because of extended family needs. So Jim Crow, societal racism has put Black Americans behind, and we are trying to fix our own problems that were created by the government, right? So we have more, but we wind up with less because we have family members who we love and who we are not going to turn a blind eye to. That society, however, and this safety net has turned a blind eye to.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can talk, retirement is really where we started our relationship a number of years ago. You talk a lot about there's so many shifts happening. And in fact, we've got our upcoming leadership forum is going to be virtual again this year, but we're going to have we're really doing a deep dive on the racial equity issues of the retirement saving system. The system itself has shifted from all defined benefit to a majority defined contribution. So you talk a lot about that and the implications of that, but you also talk about And you don't just talk about which jobs have retirement as a benefit, but who takes it and why. And so I don't know if you could say a little bit about that. There's other parity. It looks like if there's an automatic enrollment feature, correct?
If there's an automatic, if you have to opt out, so you're automatically in the retirement account, but you have to opt out, research shows more people have retirement accounts. And that comes with a fixed investment plan. And that comes with Black employees and white employees having similar investment portfolios, which is a good thing. So we know there are things that you can do, that employers can do. I argue we need to tie tax subsidies for employers to that, right? So we need to tie tax subsidies for wages to employers that pay equal wages. We should require an audit of the companies so that they see that their Black employees are not pushed into lower paying jobs when they're white employees when they're equally qualified. Mm-hmm. And over a 3 to 5 year period, if you don't fix it, you lose your wage deduction. Speaking of solutions, right? Employers are part of the problem. And honestly, so are universities, because universities should care about the research I talk about in the book, that if you're Black and a Harvard graduate, you have to send more resumes to get an interview. And then when you get an interview, you're targeted toward lower paying jobs. Harvard should be doing audit studies to see what is happening to their graduates. And if an employer keeps doing this, they should be barred from interviewing on campus. So that's true across the board, right? Colleges can do better, employers can do better, white homeowners can do better. At every stage, there are things that we can do to ameliorate it, but it's still a broken system.
Well, this is, yeah.
System.
It's that this is, I mean, it's a nail biter. There's a lot of ways to get frustrated with any particular page. It takes some time with this book to go through, because there's so many ways, once you see it, you can't unsee the ways that this plays out differently for folks. But Dorothy, I'm gonna call you an iconoclast in the way that you actually start to size up solutions. And there is a whole chapter as well on preferential, within the tax code, preferential rates.
Treatment for stocks, yep.
Stocks. But most of the, let me back up here, some of the work we did over the summer was after the murder of George Floyd, and we reached out, we said, we need to be starting to figure out how to have a new conversation in this country about wealth. We need a new wealth agenda. And we're not alone in saying that. There's the Business Roundtable was looking at an entire range of racial equity work that corporations can lead on. We're going to get into the Biden executive order. So what government can do, like that seems really exciting and important. The thing that has gotten the most play has been around, hiring more Black talent and making sure that there's more capital flowing to small businesses. Those are incredibly important, but they're also not going to close the racial wealth gap.
No. And they're not going to close the racial wealth gap because the system is designed for white wealth. Okay, until we fix the system, then we're going to see more of what we're seeing. Now, we can do things to slow it down, right? We can forgive student debt. There are things we can do to slow it down, but we actually have to have a conversation which will require white Americans to admit they got where they got, not because it's a meritocracy, but because grandma or mom and dad gave them a boost.
Well, you say that, yeah, I want to call this out in the book. I think this is where you take another turn. And I do want to get into that iconoclastic nature, because at the end of the day, you come up with 3 things. And then I want to leave us 10 minutes for question and answer. So even though there's all of these different things to do within each of these systems, at the end of the day, you go, but you know what? That's still the system. And that system is still built to privilege white
Wealth
families.
building.
And so you say a couple of things on page 213. You say, I call on white Americans to consciously shift their behaviors. If you're a white American taxpayer, no matter your income or your history, the system has benefited you at the expense of Black Americans, and you must be intentional about dismantling it. And then you also say how over and over, and I want to hear some of the stories of people, because your book is full of people and stories and experiences, that you actually ended up being, you've got amazing characters, Black Americans in here. You've got Rachel, you've got Joe Paul, you've got all these incredible folks. You have very few whites that were willing to go on record because they were uncomfortable talking about the ways that they had had advantage. And they didn't want to skew somehow that no individual wanted to skew, the way that and they didn't want to look bad. You said they downplayed the inheritances, they downplayed the gifts. They did not want to go on a record to discuss their good fortune. And so we not only have to reckon with the systems, you really do call on us to have a different dialogue. Is there chicken and egg to that?
Well, I'd say it goes back to the notion, so the white Americans that were interviewed for the book didn't want us using their last name. They didn't want to be associated, their families associated, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that this is silent really facilitates Black Americans thinking, I must be doing something wrong. Because the person sitting next to me in the same job can't be making that much more than me. How are they able to send their kids to K through 12? How are they able to buy a house? How are they able? Well, they may not have bought the house. Grandma, when she died, might have left them the house. But they don't say that. White people don't walk around saying, I have my house because my grandma gave it to me. And so we need to have a conversation about how whiteness produces wealth. And there's nothing Black people can do that will make us white, okay? So you tell us get married, higher taxes, no tax cut. Buy a house, we're gonna get screwed in the finances. Get a good job, I'm gonna have to withdraw from my retirement account to pay for my relative. Whatever it is we do, we get disadvantaged, and tax law hurts us to add insult to injury. Whereas white Americans are just living their lives, scooping up tax cuts, building wealth, and thinking, it's not that hard. I don't know why more Black people can't do it. So to some extent, this is such the norm for white Americans, they don't even know, although let's be clear, the people interviewed in the book knew, which is why they didn't want me talking about their last names, right? They don't necessarily know that this doesn't happen in all families. That's what privilege does.
And that's why the conversations seem so critical to start having out loud, right?
Yes, yes, which is one of the things I call for in the book. Tell your stories out loud, white people.
And maybe the parallel part of that, and we'll have a different conversation where I think Aspen can help do that. I think it's one of the incumbencies of our institution to help create a place that's safe for everyone. But sometimes we privilege the safety of some over others, and we need to be holding ourselves really accountable for that and changing on it. I feel at the end of the day, the stories are going to be most powerful if they're aligned with your big solutions. And I want to lay them out for folks just so people know, get through all the kids, but then get to the party at the end, because I think, Dorothy, you've done a couple of things that are also quite disruptive, even to the set of individuals who are really already deeply into solving for racial wealth inequality, because you don't go to the same, you have a pragmatic streak with how you solve for these things.
I really do.
I know. So just to say the three, I'll unpack them quickly so you can talk about them. At the end of the day, you can change all the things within each area of the tax code, but it's not going to change wealth inequality, because we're still dealing in a system that we can't see the privilege in. So the first thing you talk about is the disinfectant of daylight, and that comes in the form of data, right? So that's going to go to one piece of that. The second piece, I've decided that my term for what you want to do to the tax code is you want to Maria Kondo the tax code. You want to,
Yes!
you want to Marie Kondo the tax code, and I want to hear about that. And then at the end of it, you really do, while you talk about the need for and the ideal of reparations in the tax code, you end with a wealth credit because of what legal precedent is in this country. So I'm gonna start looking at questions, but I want you to take each of those and say a little bit about why those three for you feel like the starting point versus the iterative pieces. And there's people listening right now who now have executive orders and mandates to go do something. And so I think this all fits together in some ways.
Perfect setup. So the data. Without my book, you don't know any of this. So, and no one should be put through 25 years of research like I was to come up with this book. We need IRS statistics by race, period, end stop. And President Biden's executive order called for the disaggregation of data by race and ethnicity, among other issues like disability, et cetera, et cetera. But so I'm optimistic, but I'm not too optimistic because he doesn't have in the Treasury. So the person in the Treasury who's responsible for this is the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. This is an academic who's never written about race. So I don't know how on earth the president expects his executive order to be implemented at Treasury when the person he's put in charge talks about wealth, but not race, talks about inheritance, but not race. Okay, so Houston, we have a problem. Somebody can fix that. But we need the data, we need it public so that we can talk about it. Number two, the Maria Kondo, the tax code. Oh my God, I love that. It's basically getting rid of these deductions, exclusions, exemptions, because they're benefiting white Americans. Get them gone. Let's have all income tax the same. Income from capital should be taxed the same as income from labor. I should pay the same tax rate when I work for my money as when my money works for me, okay? And the only deduction you'd have is a living allowance. So if you don't make enough to live in your geographical area, the difference gets paid to you by the government. If you make more, then you pay tax at a progressive rate on the difference.
So that's your, yeah, okay. Is that your wealth credit? No.
No.
Next, okay.
No, that's just in my Maria Kondo system. It's
okay.
Clean. The base is broad in my system, and therefore the tax rates do not have to be that high. Okay. The wealth credit. My ideal would be to have a reparations tax credit for Black Americans like my parents who have paid higher taxes for decades. The Supreme Court's not going to allow that. They're going to find that unconstitutional. So my second best alternative that I believe the Supreme Court would readily find constitutional is a wealth credit. Anyone with below median wealth gets a tax credit, okay? So they'd wind up with a check to the government. So below median wealth, think about the gentrifying neighborhood and the elderly Black couple who's had their home forever. Well, they don't have wealth. They have below median wealth. They're going to wind up getting a tax credit that will help them pay for their increased property taxes. So the Supreme Court has said we can discriminate on the basis of wealth, which means I can have a tax system that says low wealth people, you get this break, high wealth people, no break for you.
And interestingly enough, if you do go to a wealth credit pragmatically because it's constitutional, even if it's not ideal.
Oh, white Americans will wind up getting it. Let me just say that.
And it's politically probably more feasible too. Well, I mean, these are questions to be debated in longer conversations about where there's deep uncomfort with a wealth tax, a wealth credit, potentially, you know,
yes.
it's a different thing. There's a lot of other issues here as well. But I think that the data provides us with the ability to refute our own information we have with our own reference group, right?
Right.
We can really have real conversations around that. the need to look at tax reform, and it's been since 1986 since we've had a major tax reform for households. So there's a lot of, I think, conversation around that. And I think especially grouped with the executive order and the IRS, we can look at that. And then the wealth credit, we can get into that as well. If you want to click 2, let's look at the questions and answers, because we've got about 10 minutes left and we've got some really good questions from great folks in here.
The one thing I want to say about the tax data, the president is starting to talk about his tax plan, but there's a disconnect because he's not connecting it with race. He's talking about tax proposals, but no one in the administration is remembering he signed this executive order. Why are we going to collect race and tax data if not to apply in tax reform discussions? So whenever you hear someone talking about a tax reform proposal, you should be thinking, what impact is that going to have on the racial wealth gap? Mm-hmm. What are the racial disparate impacts of that proposal? And if you're not hearing it from the Biden administration is not living up to what they said they were going to do with that executive order.
And I was listening with you last night. Like you think like it's a good first step. There's going to need to be a lot of external pressure, encouragement,
yes.
help.
Yes, because I'm already seeing this conversation about Biden's tax plan, and no one is talking about race. And it's like, did he not mean it when he said it? I believe he meant it when he said it, but because race and tax has not previously been connected together, people don't get. You cannot talk about tax policy without talking about race. You just can't.
Yep. There's some great questions. There's some deep questions in our Q&A, Dorothy. So in one way, I think we'll probably we'll take a pen to this, and we might do some Q&A afterwards. And we might even do some additional roundtables if you're up for it with some of these exact audiences you're talking about wanting to be able to influence. But let me come up with a couple of these here. A number of people are talking about reparations and should estate taxes fund reparations? Does the book address reparations? Maybe say a little bit more about how you've come, what's in here and what still needs to be grappled with.
So to be clear, I talk about a reparations tax credit as a way to compensate Black taxpayers who have paid extra. That's the extent of my discussion of reparations in the book. Sandy Darity and Kristen Mullen have written a book, From Here to Equality, an entire book about reparations. I recommend you read it. The book I want to write next is about reparations. That's the next book. That's not this book, okay? So in talking about reparations, I don't want you to buy the book and then be disappointed that I'm only talking about the reparations tax credit. But again, I support reparations, but if every Black person were to get $100,000 tomorrow, we would use it in a system designed for white wealth. We have to clean up the system that produces white wealth before reparations, in my opinion, could make a significant dent.
Well, you
I
have
totally
that,
agree.
And you have that about, you're favorably inclined around the baby bond idea, except that if you put that into the existing system, you're like, say somebody at 18 does have 46,000 and they have that extended family. You have your doubts that, again, without the cleaning up of the system, these are the right solutions, but they need an additional layer of fix.
What they need, I think, is to be based on wealth and not income, because you actually have high income Black Americans who don't have a lot of wealth because they are paying for family members. So, baby bonds that would pay for college, that could pay for homes in the messed up system, right? So they would get the most bang for their buck if they cleaned up the system. But if we saw baby bonds tomorrow, it would make a difference in the lives of individual Black Americans. So I saw a question I want to talk to. It says, progressive tax helps Black people, which is exactly what the comment was made to me in 2002. Dorothy, Black people are poor. They don't pay a lot in taxes. What are you talking about? Au contraire. It said something about white people have higher income, but they also have more deductions. So it isn't just, an $80,000 white person with income and an $80,000 Black person with income, they're going to wind up with different taxable income because white Americans are going to, that same household is going to have a mortgage interest deduction that the Black household may not have. They're going to have tax-free gifts that the Black person is not getting. So our system that tells you if you make $80,000, you're equal is the problem. That is not our progressive tax system benefits white Americans because a lot of white Americans get out of the progressive tax system by having stock that's taxed at the low preferential rate. So this notion that progressive tax helps Black people, no, I wrote a whole book refuting that.
And the marriage chapter, which we glossed over, actually goes into a lot of the aha moments you had trying to understand most of this. I know we're going to have to wrap up. I'll end us on this broader question because I think there's a major opportunity here. And I think this is why your book is so timely. There's a reckoning happening in America with racial inequity. And there are leaders in the private sector and there are leaders in the public sector that mean to take action, to deliver.
Agreed.
And so I think that at the moment, we need to be getting smart and fast about who needs to be talking to who. And so one of the questions here is about who needs to be at the table in order to craft, and I would say, in order to craft blank, more equitable tax policy, more equitable education, more equitable,
yes.
Who needs to be at the table to craft more equitable governance structures in business? I think there's a bit of a generic answer from you about who are the kinds of people. You can't be at every table, Dorothy, but how do we start this process?
So who needs to be at the table are partly, one, they're the community organizers who've been working on these issues forever. They are the scholars who have been working on these issues. So let's be clear. White reporters have been calling me about race and tax since the murder of George Floyd. I spent the prior 23, 24 years in the wilderness, okay? I couldn't get a white reporter who wanted to talk to me about race and tax. So I think you're right. We are at a moment, but I think anyone who wants to make a difference needs to get informed, needs to read, needs to who's been doing the work. In every area, there are people who have been doing the work. There are other people who have written about, so Jeremy Berafriend, who's a professor at George Washington Law School, wrote an amazing piece about the IRS as colorblind, right? He needs to be at the table. He's young, he's got lots of energy. You couldn't pay me to be at those tables, right?
So there's a deeper bench. And as with most things right now, it's going to be incumbent on us to be super intentional and do our homework.
And inclusive.
And it's not okay to not have a very different set of people. And wow, what's going to be different because we are. My pleasure today has been talking to you about this book, The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax Policy in America impoverishes Black Americans and how we can fix it. My own sense is that we're going to fix a lot more about America if we do this work. And thank you for your leadership and thank you for your time. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.